The United States left over $7 billion worth of weapons and equipment behind in Afghanistan, and those weapons are falling into the hands of the Taliban. When the US-backed government in Afghanistan fell in 2021 under pressure from a Taliban insurgents, the States was left with a choice: re-enter the fight or back out and leave the government to its own devices. It chose the latter. The US exited stage left, and it did so fast that it didn't even bother to scoop up a lot of the equipment that it had been using in the country. And now, according to a recent Pentagon report, we actually have a dollar figure on what was left behind. Egg is on the face of the US government, but this revelation leads to more questions. What exactly did the US leave behind? And could that equipment not only fall into Taliban hands, but actually be used by Afghanistan's new government to fend off attempts to overthrow it? To answer those questions, we'll start by looking at what equipment we know is still in Afghanistan. Interestingly, the fact that the US left so much behind isn't fresh news. In 2021, the BBC reported on the Americans and Their Escape Act, pointing out that the US abandoned 73 aircraft, along with 100 vehicles and a lot of other equipment, while making its exit. Among the aircraft were several A-29 attack planes and a large number of MD-530 reconnaissance helicopters. The article goes on to state the Afghan government had access to 23 of those A-29s along with 43 MD-530s as recently as the June prior to the Taliban's attack. It gets worse. The same report discusses how the US also left 7 Sea Knights, one of the US Navy's main attack helicopters, along with several land-based vehicles. It points out that Kabul ended up playing host to 27 Humvees and an unspecified quantity of artillery defense systems and explosives. Even more damaging to America's public image, photos started circulating of the Taliban finding this abandoned weaponry, giving rise to the thought that they were going to co-opt it for their own use. At the time, the head of U.S. Central Command, General Kenneth McKenzie, took a bullish response to the news. Yes, the U.S. had left all of this equipment behind, but that was all right. It had been rendered inoperable by the troops before evacuating Afghanistan. So even if the Taliban did get its hands on the equipment, it wouldn't be able to use any of it to fight against Afghani forces. The BBC also quoted experts who pointed out that even if the equipment were operable, it wouldn't mean much to the Taliban forces that don't have trained pilots or the ability to maintain the equipment moving forward. However, that proclamation doesn't tell us the full story. Though satellite imagery picked up on explosions being used to destroy as much equipment as possible, it also found examples of Afghan troops making no effort to render vehicles and planes inoperable. In some cases, troops fled without trying to destroy anything, leaving the equipment ready to use should the Taliban understand how to get it up and running. The same BBC report also pointed out that larger equipment wasn't the only concern in this situation. Pictures from Kabul emerged at the same time that showed Special Forces members of the Taliban clearly using M4 rifles. The suggestion was that even if the larger equipment wasn't usable, there was still a treasure trove of weapons the Taliban could use. That was all reported in 2021. Then came April 2022 and the Pentagon's report. Mandated by Congress, the report revealed that $7.12 billion worth of the $18.6 billion of equipment that the U.S. provided to the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces, or ANDSF, was left behind. As was reported by the BBC, much of this equipment included aircraft, vehicles, weapons, and artillery. However, communications equipment was also left behind, as were other materials. The report also points out that the U.S. currently has no plans to re-enter Afghanistan to reclaim any of the equipment, likely because it could reignite fighting with the Taliban. The report also restates the message that most of the remaining equipment was either destroyed or requires, quote, specialized maintenance that Department of Defense contractors previously provided. But again, that isn't the full story. According to the DoD spokesperson, Army Major Rob Lodwick, the $7.12 billion figure doesn't apply to the equipment that the U.S. forces used while stationed in Afghanistan. It only applies to equipment provided to the ANDSF. He goes on to state that nearly all the equipment the U.S. used itself was destroyed or retrograded, apparently in an effort to diffuse Congress's concerns about the volume of the equipment left behind. There's just one problem: the ANDSF isn't in power anymore. According to West Point's Combating Terrorism Center, or CTC, the ANDSF essentially collapsed during its battles with the Taliban in April and May of 2021. Worse yet, the CTC points out that the ANDSF utterly failed to organize organic resupply efforts, an issue that the U.S. had seen in the forces for years, which contributed to their rapid loss. So Lodwick's efforts to minimize the impact of the news appear to have failed. Not only was the $7.12 billion worth of equipment in the hands of a fighting force that's been utterly overwhelmed by the Taliban, but the previously mentioned BBC article points out that the ANDSF did a less than stellar job of decommissioning what it had. It's here that we start to see contradictions appearing in the story. Back in 2021, General Kenneth McKenzie claimed that the equipment was left inoperable by U.S. forces, but it appears he conveniently forgot to mention that a lot of the equipment wasn't even in the country's hands, having been delivered to the ANDSF. Sure, the U.S. can make a confident claim that it disabled most of its own arms and vehicles. But as for what the ANDSF was using, it seems the best they can do is shrug their shoulders and hope for the best. And this is emphasized when the report gets to the military vehicles the U.S. delivered to the ANDSF over the course of its time in Afghanistan. Of the 96,000 vehicles the U.S. provided, 40,000 remained in Afghanistan, ostensibly under ANDSF control, when it left in 2021. As for the operational condition of these vehicles, many of which have surely fallen into Taliban hands, the Pentagon can use only one word: unknown. The picture gets bleaker. Over 300,000 of the weapons the U.S. provided to the ANDSF were left behind, along with 1.537 million small arms and specialty munitions. As for communications equipment, quote, nearly all of it remained with the quickly deteriorating Afghan forces, including military radio systems, base stations, and portable communication systems. A staggering 42,000 pieces of specialized equipment, including night vision goggles and surveillance equipment, remained in the country. And wrapping the highlights for the report up, the U.S. left behind 17,500 pieces of electronic and explosive countermeasure equipment. The U.S. may claim that this equipment wasn't, quote, left behind. It could even go so far as to say that this equipment should be more than enough for the ANDSF to defend itself against the Taliban fighters. But we already know that wasn't the case. The Taliban captured Kabul, the ANDSF fled, and now we have no idea just how much of the U.S. made and provided equipment given to the ANDSF had fallen into Taliban hands. What we do know is that there's a lot of it. Where the BBC's 2021 report highlighted a comparative handful of vehicles and munitions, the Pentagon's 2022 report reveals the true scale of the problem. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of thousands of weapons, and millions of rounds of ammunition are in Afghanistan, ready for the taking, assuming they haven't been taken already. Still, the U.S. has two bright spots to pull from the report. The first is the Pentagon claims it transferred 5 Mi-17 helicopters that it left behind to Ukraine in 2022. That transfer happened in January before Russia's invasion, and those helicopters have remained in Ukraine since. They'll likely never make their way back to Afghanistan, but the caveat of this tiny bright spot is that the transfer was going to happen regardless. All 5 of the choppers were in Ukraine to undergo maintenance when Afghanistan's government collapsed, meaning that they're simply not examples of the U.S. reclaiming equipment from the country. They were just going to fix it and send it back, until the Taliban made that impossible. Same goes for several pieces of equipment that were initially procured for Afghanistan. Apparently a lot of non-standard munitions, including 37,000 howitzer rockets that were meant for Afghanistan, ended up going to Ukraine, as did over 15 million rounds of rifle ammunition and a large number of explosives and mortar rounds. A small victory for the Pentagon as it tried to justify what it left behind, but ultimately a drop in the ocean compared to what the ANDSF received and presumably lost. But hey, at least the U.S. can claim to have demilitarized most of the aircraft that the BBC reported on in 2021. The Pentagon's report says that all 78 of the aircraft it provided to the ANDSF were stationed at Hamid Karzai International Airport at the time of America's withdrawal. That's the airport that the U.S. used to evacuate, so it was at least able to personally assure that these aircraft were rendered inoperable. For context, those aircraft amounted to about $923 million worth of equipment, all up in smoke because the U.S. rightfully didn't trust the ANDSF to use it to fight back against the Taliban. A Pyrrhic victory, then. Let's move on to the second point. Though the U.S. technically didn't leave any of its own munitions behind, it still left over $7 billion worth of equipment with the ANDSF that had been toppled by the Taliban. But that's okay. The U.S. can still claim that most of the Taliban forces don't have the skills to use much of what was left behind, and even if it does, it certainly doesn't know how to maintain all that equipment. But is that really the truth? For starters, the many guns and over 1 million rounds of ammunition the U.S. left in Afghanistan don't really require any specialist training to use. Get a gun, load the ammo, point the barrel, pull the trigger. That's all the Taliban fighter really needs to know. And they'll already have that knowledge from the guns that they're using. It wouldn't take long for any of the semi-experienced fighters to adapt to U.S. small arms. But the U.S. could also argue that the Taliban would burn through that small arms ammunition fairly quickly. They still can't use the more complex equipment. Except that's not the case either. According to a report released by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, or SIGAR, John Sopko, in February 2023, the Taliban is learning how to use a lot of the equipment the U.S. left behind. Sopko pointed out that while some of the equipment was destroyed, as the Pentagon says a huge amount of it wasn't. Even worse, he said the U.S. had a, quote, horrible system in place to keep track of the weaponry it brought over and how it was being used. He then goes on to point out the most worrying aspect of all of this when he says, "We have seen and we have picked up intelligence that the Taliban are actually flying some of the helicopters and some of the planes." That's not to mention his presumption that the organization has figured out how to use the comms gear and other sophisticated hardware it's found in the country. That runs counter to the expert claims that the Taliban wouldn't be able to use the equipment. Sopko says it can. He even points to satellite imagery showcasing the Taliban are clearly more adept at adapting to American hardware than many felt it would be. So when the US left so much of its equipment behind, it wasn't leaving it to a ragtag group of insurgents who had no clue how to operate it. Instead, the equipment fell into the hands of a group determined to empower itself in any way possible, a group much smarter than many give it credit for. That ability to adapt isn't the only problem the US didn't anticipate. Despite all the bluster about rendering equipment inoperable and the Taliban being unable to use it, nobody seemed to account for the fact that the group had another option available: selling what it couldn't use. In January 2023, NBC published a report claiming that some of the weapons the US left in Afghanistan are showing up in other conflicts. Specifically, they're being used to arm militant groups in Kashmir. Fighters trying to wrest control of Kashmir from India have been seen sporting M4s and M16s, both US-made arms that should not be in the region, as well as using ammunition for those guns. Both the Lashkar-e-Taiba and the Jaish-e-Mohammed groups, each designated as terrorist organizations by the US, are proven to have access to those American weapons. And as an NBC report points out, both groups have sent militants to Afghanistan to train alongside the Taliban. According to an email written by Indian Army spokesperson Imran Musavi, it can be safely assumed that they have access to the weapons left behind. It also appears that these weapons were making their way into the hands of militant groups much earlier than the beginning of 2023. In January 2022, a video surfaced of militants wielding what seemed to be American guns on social media. Those videos were shared widely in India, though at the time some claimed that the weapons may have been modified to look like American guns. That appears to no longer be the case, with the Indian military pointing out that it has since found 7 authentic US rifles, suggesting that the Taliban isn't just arming itself with a bounty of US weapons, it's arming other terrorist organizations. Another report published by Radio Free Europe in March 2023 points out that the LET and JEM aren't the only militant groups that the Taliban is likely supplying. Similar groups inside Pakistan also seem to have US weapons. According to observers, the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, or TTP, has seen its military capabilities strengthened substantially now that it has access to M4s and M16s. Plus, the report says that these groups have started using the communications equipment and night vision goggles that America left behind. US weapons also found their way into the hands of the Baloch separatist groups, which are waging their own war against Pakistan over the last 2 years. Herein, we see more of what the US actually left behind in Afghanistan. It wasn't just weaponry and equipment, it was a stockpile so large that it's enabled the Taliban to empower other groups that align with its vision for the world, creating havoc in other countries in the process. That's highlighted by a Sweden-based researcher named Abdul Saeed, who said that the TTP having access to American guns has had a terrifying impact. He points out that Pakistan's police force isn't as well equipped as the TTP now, making internal conflicts not only more likely in general, but more likely to play out in favor of the TTP. Nowhere is that more obvious than the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province. One of the focal points for TTP attacks, the province's police are being overwhelmed by militants who simply have better equipment than they do. One who spoke to Radio Free Europe on condition of being granted anonymity makes the scope of the issue clear. The fact is, they can see us in the dark while we can't. That gives the terrorists an enormous advantage. A former police chief in the region, Moazzam Jah Ansari, backs up that point by telling journalists that the TTP had picked up weapons left behind by America and is now using them to wage their own small war against the region's police officers. And that war is growing in size. Figures released by the Pakistan Institute of Peace Studies, PIPS, revealed that an increase in terrorist attacks has come along with this pipeline of black market American weaponry into the country. In 2022, attacks increased by 27% when compared to the previous year, leading to a grand total of 262. Over 419 people died in those attacks, a further 734 were injured. And 2023 didn't start off any better. On January 15th, 3 police officers, including a senior officer named Sardar Hussain Khan, were killed in the city of Peshawar by terrorist snipers. The authorities later found out that the rifle used to commit the killings was equipped with a thermal scope that likely traces its roots back to the stockpile left behind in Afghanistan. The quick escape from Afghanistan may have been the best thing for the United States at the time, but it resulted in a black market trade in the weapons that it left behind that has only made insurgent forces in the Middle East even stronger. The Taliban in Afghanistan are not only better equipped than they should be, they're richer because they can sell those weapons to other groups. Plus, they're now able to extend their influence and build stronger ties with other insurgents, which could lead to more coordinated attacks in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere in the future. And of course, there are all of the secrets. Let's imagine for a moment that we live in America's idealized version of events, in which every last piece of equipment that it left behind was rendered inoperable. Of course, we know that isn't the case, but let's pretend it is. That doesn't change the fact that the Taliban fighters and the groups to which it sells these weapons can still reverse engineer them to figure out how they work. The US didn't just leave weapons and equipment behind, it left decades of military secrets that other countries can now discover just by purchasing a few weapons from the Taliban. Defense One, which covers news and offers analysis on national security, had an interesting theory about this back in September 2021. It said that the ultimate winner from the near 20 years that the United States spent in Afghanistan wouldn't be Afghanistan or the US or the Taliban, it'll be China. That may sound strange to people who don't realize that Beijing and the Taliban have had an on-off relationship for several decades. Though the two sides share little in the way of ideology, China is savvy enough to realize the Taliban isn't some mere insurgent force that the authorities in Afghanistan will eventually quash. It has already practically won the war. Afghanistan is a Taliban state, and if China is to continue playing the role of leader of Asia, it needs to set itself up as a partner and investor in Taliban-led Afghanistan. For its part, the Taliban is also smart enough to see the obvious benefits that come from building closer ties with China. In July 2021, mere months after it stormed Kabul, the Taliban's representatives called China a, quote, welcome friend in the country. It's also made promises that the Taliban will not use its territorial gains in Afghanistan to interfere with anything that Beijing is doing in other countries. That is excellent news for China. Stability in Asia is its goal because stability gives it more opportunities to expand its influence. And in the Taliban, China may see a group that shares its anti-West sentiment, even if its religious ideology doesn't appeal to Beijing, creating the potential for a strong relationship that could come back to bite the US in the coming years. How? Defense One points out that China's growing relationship with the Taliban means it could now have access to some of the equipment the US left behind in Afghanistan. Unlike the insurgent groups that the Taliban is equipping, China likely isn't interested in actually using any of these weapons in open conflict. That would give the game away. But it can absolutely examine what the US has already built, with Defense One positing that every piece of equipment left behind could essentially be a laboratory for China, one that reveals the way the US makes its weapons. That's certainly the opinion of Josh Lospinoso, who's the CEO of a cybersecurity company named Shift5, and is a man who has a decade of US Army experience under his belt. When talking about an Afghan Air Force C-130 plane that the Taliban captured, he said, "You now have some or all of the electronic components on that system, and it's a representative laboratory." He went on to call that plane a, quote, playground for the building and testing of cyber attacks that other countries like China could use to weaken the US. And that's an interesting point. A plane or a military vehicle isn't just one piece of equipment, it's essentially a home to tons of radios, communication systems, and electronic wizardry that an enemy of the United States could unravel and reverse engineer to figure out how America's equipment works. Once those secrets are out there, the US is in a tough spot. Any country that has them knows the strengths and weaknesses of the equipment it'll deploy in combat. Plus, it'll know how to build that equipment and perhaps how to improve on it, thus accelerating its own weapons development by several years because it had the perfect opportunity to learn from one of the best in the game. So, the true scope of what the US left behind in Afghanistan is revealed. thousands upon thousands of pieces of equipment, millions of rounds of small arms ammunition, and several decades of military secrets, despite the Pentagon's claims of decommissioning, could be used to strengthen some of America's largest adversaries and their militaries. The Taliban hit the motherlode, and the U.S. can do little more than lick its wounds and hope that as few of its weapons as possible find their way into more dangerous hands. Perhaps the true extent of the damage caused by America's rapid exit from Afghanistan has yet to be realized. But now we want to hear from you. Do you think the U.S. made the right call by getting out of the country so quickly that it left behind so much equipment? What, if any, ramifications may this stockpile have on the U.S. as tensions continue to simmer in China and the Middle East? Tell us what you think in the comments section, and thank you for watching the video. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.